colored pencils scattered across the pink carpet as Sophie Warren, age 8 3/4, the 3/4 being very important, sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor. Her small fingers moved with careful precision across the paper, adding the final touches to her latest masterpiece. The afternoon sun streamed through her window, casting a warm glow on the dozens of drawings already taped to her wall, a gallery of memories captured through a child's eyes. There she whispered, holding up her newest creation. The picture showed 3 stick figures: a tall woman with brown hair in hospital scrubs mummy, a little girl with pigtails herself, and a man in a business suit, daddy drawn slightly apart from the others. A dotted line connected him to the other figures, like a path waiting to be walked. Sophie had started drawing her family pictures differently 6 months ago. When Daddy moved into what he called his temporary apartment, she didn't quite understand what temporary meant anymore. It felt like forever since they'd all lived together in their big house with the tire swing in the backyard. She reached for her special purple marker, the one that smelled like grapes, to add hearts around the edges of the drawing. That's when she heard her mother's voice drift up from the kitchen below, sharp and brittle like ice cracking. "David, you can't keep changing the schedule like this. Sophie was counting on seeing you this weekend. No, your work is not more important than your daughter. Oh, so you'll be with her instead." Sophie's hand froze mid-heart. She knew that tone in her mother's voice, the one that made it sound like she was trying not to cry. Quietly, she crept to her bedroom door and pressed her ear against the cool wood. "Fine. You do whatever you want. You're good at that. Just don't expect me to explain to Sophie why her father keeps disappointing her." The sound of her mother's phone hitting the counter echoed through the house, followed by a muffled sob that made Sophie's chest hurt. Looking back at her drawing, Sophie's eyes narrowed with determination. She grabbed a red pencil and began connecting all 3 figures with bold, straight lines, pressing so hard the pencil tip nearly broke. In her 8-year-old mind, a plan was forming, one that would make her family whole again. "If grown-ups can't fix it," she murmured, adding one final line to complete the triangle, "then I'll have to do it myself." She didn't know exactly how yet, but Sophie Warren was going to bring her family back together. After all, she thought as she surveyed her wall of family portraits, sometimes it took a child's eyes to see what adults had forgotten how to see: the simple truth that love should be stronger than whatever was keeping them apart. T. Saint. Mary's elementary school, Sophie's teachers often exchanged knowing glances when she spoke. "She's an old soul," they'd whisper, watching her comfort crying kindergartners, or methodically organize the class library by color and size. While other 3rd graders rushed to recess, Sophie would linger behind, asking questions that made adults pause. Why do people fall out of love? Or how do you know if someone's really happy or just pretending? Her big brown eyes seemed to absorb everything, cataloging details others missed. Like how her mother's scrubs always smelled of lavender detergent and hospital antiseptic, or how her father's architectural sketches had begun featuring more curves and fewer straight lines since he'd moved out, just like her designs. Elena Warren hadn't planned on being a single mother at 42. The night shift at Metro General's pediatric ward kept her busy, but not busy enough to forget the empty side of her bed or the silence that filled the house when Sophie was with David. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, concealed by makeup applied in the early morning hours. Her once pristine garden now sprouted weeds between the roses, but she couldn't bring herself to pull them. Gardening had been their Sunday ritual, hers and David's. "We're managing just fine," she'd tell her sister during their weekly calls, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. But late at night, when Sophie was asleep, Elena would sit in their too large kitchen, nursing a cup of tea gone cold, wondering how her carefully planned life had unraveled so completely. David Warren stood at the top of his field, his modernist designs gracing the covers of architectural magazines. At 45, he had everything. He'd worked for the corner office, the prestigious projects, the respect of his peers. And Sarah. Beautiful, passionate Sarah, 15 years his junior, who saw the artist in him when he'd begun to feel like just another suburban husband. His new apartment in the city's trendy warehouse district bore little resemblance to the warm family home he'd left behind. Steel and glass dominated the space, with carefully curated furniture that Sarah had helped select. But sometimes late at night, he found himself missing the chaos of Sophie's toys scattered across the floor. The squeak of that one kitchen cabinet hinge Elena had always nagged him to fix. Sarah Chen hadn't meant to fall in love with a married man. At 30, she was making a name for herself in interior design, her minimalist aesthetic perfectly complementing David's architectural vision. They'd started as colleagues, sharing coffee and design ideas. Then came late nights at the office, passionate discussions about form and function, and finally, stolen kisses in the blueprint room. Her townhouse reflected her taste: clean lines, neutral colors, and carefully chosen artwork. No family photos cluttered her surfaces, no crayon drawings adorned her refrigerator. She told herself this was the life she'd chosen: sophisticated, unencumbered. But sometimes, watching David check his phone for messages from Sophie, she felt a hollow ache she couldn't quite name. The contrast between the two homes couldn't have been starker. The Warren family house, a sprawling colonial in the suburbs, still bore the marks of a family's life: Sophie's height measurements penciled on the kitchen doorframe, Elena's collection of mismatched coffee mugs, the worn spot on the stairs where David used to sit to remove his work boots. Even with David gone, every room held echoes of their shared past. Meanwhile, David's apartment seemed to exist in a different universe, one where children's laughter never echoed off the walls, where no one spilled juice on the pristine white couch, where even the air seemed filtered of memory and mess. It was a place designed for the man David thought he wanted to be, not the father and husband he'd been for the past 9 years. Sophie had planned everything perfectly. Instead of boarding the yellow school bus that Wednesday afternoon, she tucked herself behind the big oak tree near the school parking lot, her Hello Kitty backpack clutched tight against her chest. She'd heard her father tell Mum he couldn't pick her up because of an important site visit. The same excuse he'd been using a lot lately. Her heart thumped against her ribs as she watched her father's silver Audi pull out of the school's visitor parking. He'd dropped off her forgotten math homework earlier that day, something that used to be Mum's job. Sophie counted to 20, just like she'd practiced, then darted across the playground to the street behind the school. Following someone, Sophie discovered, was much harder in real life than in the spy movies she loved to watch. She had to duck behind trees, pretend to tie her shoes, and once even hide behind a very confused elderly lady walking her poodle. But Sophie was nothing if not persistent. The familiar streets of their suburb gave way to rows of elegant townhouses, each one looking like the fancy dollhouses in the toy store window. Her father's car finally slowed in front of a cream-colored building with large windows and perfectly trimmed boxwood bushes. Sophie watched from behind a parked moving van as he climbed the steps, pressed a button, and disappeared inside. "This must be where she lives," Sophie whispered to herself, remembering the fragments of angry phone calls and tear-filled conversations she'd overheard. She hadn't meant to wait so long, but the sun was starting to sink when her father finally emerged. He looked different, somehow lighter, smiling in a way she hadn't seen in months. Sophie waited until his car turned the corner, then approached the townhouse. Her legs trembled as she climbed the same steps her father had. The brass doorbell gleamed in the late afternoon light. Before she could lose her courage, she pressed it. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The woman was pretty, like a princess in her storybooks, with long black hair and kind eyes. She wore a flowing white blouse and dark pants that looked like they'd never been wrinkled. "Hello," Sarah's voice was gentle, confused. "Can I help you?" Sophie's carefully rehearsed speech vanished from her mind. Instead, she blurted out, "I'm doing a school project about different types of houses, and yours is the prettiest on the street. Could I maybe draw it?" Sarah's expression softened. "You're an artist. How wonderful. But sweetie, where are your parents? It's getting late." "My mum knows I'm here," Sophie lied, fingers crossed behind her back. "She's waiting in the coffee shop around the corner. I just need a few pictures for reference." "Please?" "It's for a very important grade." Sarah hesitated, looking down the street as if expecting to see a concerned mother. Sophie held her breath, channeling what her mother called her angel face, the one that usually earned her extra dessert. "Well, I suppose that would be all right. Actually, I'm an interior designer. Would you like to see inside too? The architecture is quite special." Sophie's heart leapt. This was even better than she'd hoped. Could I? That would be amazing. "I love architecture." The word rolled off her tongue carefully. She'd practiced saying it just like her father did. Sarah led her into a world of cream and silver, glass and light. Everything looked expensive and untouchable, like a museum after hours. Sophie clutched her sketchbook tighter, suddenly aware of her scuffed sneakers on the pristine hardwood floors. "Would you like some hot chocolate while you sketch?" Sarah offered, watching the little girl's wide-eyed exploration of the space. "I even have those tiny marshmallows." Sophie nodded, settling onto a sleek white sofa. She opened her sketchbook, carefully turning past the family drawings until she found a blank page. As Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, Sophie's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail: the fresh flowers in tall vases, the architecture magazines spread perfectly on the coffee table. And there, partially hidden behind a large photo of a cityscape, a smaller frame containing a picture of her father, smiling with his arm around Sarah. Sophie's hand moved across the paper, but she wasn't drawing the house. Instead, she began sketching Sarah, adding details that might help explain why her father spent so much time here: the pretty smile, the elegant clothes, the way everything around her seemed peaceful and perfect. "Here you go," Sarah returned with a steaming mug topped with tiny marshmallows. "You're quite talented. What's your name?" "Sophie," she answered truthfully, then quickly added, "Like Sophie Turner from Game of Thrones. My mum loves that show." Another lie, but she'd heard the older girls at school talking about it. "Well, Sophie, you have a wonderful eye for detail. Is architecture something you're interested in?" "My dad's an architect," Sophie said, watching Sarah's face carefully. But Sarah just smiled, apparently not making the connection. As the evening shadows lengthened, Sophie knew she should leave, but she had one more card to play. This was so helpful. "Would it be okay if I came back tomorrow? There's still so much I need to draw," and she bit her lip, the way she'd practiced. "You explain things so well. Almost like a real teacher." Sarah beamed at the compliment. "I suppose that would be fine as long as your mother doesn't mind. Same time tomorrow." Sophie nodded, gathering her things. Her plan was working perfectly, but now she just had to figure out how to keep her daily bus absence a secret from her mother, and more importantly, how to use these visits to bring her family back together. Over the next 2 weeks, Sophie became a regular fixture at Sarah's townhouse. Each afternoon, she would settle into her spot on the white sofa, sketchbook open, absorbing every detail of Sarah's world. She noticed how Sarah always smelled like vanilla and expensive perfume, nothing like her mother's familiar scent of hospital soap and coffee. Sarah moved differently, too gracefully, like she was dancing through her perfectly organized rooms. "Would you like to see some of my design work?" Sarah offered one afternoon, spreading blueprints across her glass dining table. "These are for a new downtown project." Sophie's heart skipped when she recognized her father's distinctive architectural style in the drawings. "The lines are pretty," she said carefully, "but where would the kids play?" Sarah looked startled. "Kids? Every home needs a special place for kids," Sophie explained, thinking of her own backyard with its tire swing and chalk-covered driveway. "My dad always says she caught herself too late." Sarah's elegant eyebrows drew together. "Your dad?" The moment stretched between them like a soap bubble about to pop. Sophie quickly changed the subject, asking about the crystal vases on the windowsill, but she saw something shift in Sarah's eyes, the first glimpse of suspicion. That evening, as Sarah worked on her laptop, Sophie found herself drawn to a small alcove near the kitchen. A corkboard hung there, partially hidden, covered with photos. Her father appeared in several of them at parties, on a beach, smiling wider than she'd seen him smile in years. But one photo made her pause: her father and Sarah at what looked like an office party, dancing. The way they looked at each other reminded Sophie of an old photo hidden in her mother's bedside drawer, her parents on their wedding day, young and in love. The memory hit her with unexpected force. Sunday mornings before everything changed, her father making his famous chocolate chip pancakes, her mother still in her pajamas, dancing with him to old songs on the radio. Sophie would watch from the doorway, giggling as they twirled around the kitchen, leaving the pancakes to burn. "Sophie," Sarah's voice cut through the memory. "Are you all right?" Sophie wiped quickly at her eyes. "I was just thinking about dancing," she said softly. "Do you like to dance, Sarah?" Yes, I do." Sarah seemed thrown by the question, by the sadness in this suddenly familiar-looking child's eyes. She took a closer look at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time, and the color drained from her face. Those eyes, That determined chin, Sophie Warren, she whispered. You're David's daughter. The sound of her full name in Sarah's mouth made Sophie's stomach twist. She hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't thought beyond her simple plan to understand the woman who had captured her father's heart. Sarah sank into a chair, her perfect posture crumpling. Does your mother know you're here? Does David? Before Sophie could answer, her phone buzzed, the prepaid one she'd bought with her saved allowance money. Her mother's text lit up the screen. Where are you? The school called. You haven't been on the bus all week. Come home now. Across town, Elena Warren paced her kitchen, phone clutched in her shaking hand. The school's automated message played again in her head. Your child has been marked absent from afternoon bus service for the past 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Her baby had been lying to her, disappearing to who knows where, for 2 weeks. She'd already called David, who was equally shocked and worried. I'm leaving work now, he'd said, his voice tight with concern. I'll drive around, check her usual places. But Elena knew her daughter. Sophie wasn't the type to wander aimlessly. If she'd been disappearing every afternoon, she had a destination in mind. Elena's eyes fell on Sophie's latest drawing, partially visible in her open backpack, a sketch of an elegant room she didn't recognize, with a woman's figure outlined in the background. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She knew exactly where her daughter had been going. Back in the townhouse, Sarah watched Sophie frantically gathering her things. Sophie, wait, we need to talk about this. I need to call your father. Please don't, Sophie begged, but Sarah was already pulling out her phone. The girl froze as she heard her father's ringtone echo from the front hallway, followed by the sound of a key in the lock. David Warren stepped into his girlfriend's townhouse, his face etched with worry as he spoke into his phone. Elena, I'll check Sarah's place next. Sophie might have. He stopped abruptly, staring at his daughter standing in Sarah's living room, her guilty face streaked with tears. Dad, Sophie whispered. Sarah stood between them, her own face a mask of shock and dismay. David, I had no idea. She never said. I should have realized. The front door burst open again, revealing Elena, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, her face flushed from running. She'd followed her instincts and her heart straight to this address, one she'd found months ago in David's phone but had never visited. 4 people stood in Sarah's perfect living room, the carefully maintained boundaries between their separate worlds finally, irreversibly shattered. The silence in Sarah's pristine living room crackled with tension. Elena's hands trembled as she stepped towards Sophie, her voice barely controlled. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? What were you thinking? I'm sorry, Mummy, Sophie whispered, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. Elena, David started, moving toward his wife, but she cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. Don't you dare try to manage this situation, David. Our 8-year-old daughter has been coming to your girlfriend's house behind our backs. This is beyond. I didn't know who she was, Sarah interjected, her composed demeanor cracking. She said she was doing a school project about architecture. I would never have. You wouldn't have what? Elena's voice rose. Wouldn't have let my daughter into your home, the home you share with my husband, the home that's apparently more important than. Stop it, Sophie's shout shocked everyone into silence. Her small body shook as she opened her sketchbook, pages fluttering. Please, just stop fighting and look. Please. The adults turned to the little girl, watching as she spread her drawings across Sarah's coffee table. Page after page of memories captured in crayon and colored pencil. Mum and Dad dancing in the kitchen, family picnics in the park, Dad teaching Sophie to ride her bike while Mum took pictures, Christmas mornings, and bedtime stories. These are the happy times, Sophie explained, her voice growing stronger. And these, she pulled out more recent drawings. Dad sitting alone in his new apartment, Mum crying in the garden, empty chairs at the dinner table, and finally the most recent one, Sarah's townhouse, with its perfect rooms that somehow still felt sad. I came here because I needed to understand, Sophie continued, looking at Sarah. I needed to know why Dad chose to be here instead of with us. But you know what I learned? Her eyes moved to her father, who looked like he'd been struck. Nobody's happy. Not really. Not Mum, not Dad, not even you, Sarah. Sarah sank onto her white sofa, perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sophie, honey, David began, but Sophie wasn't finished. You smile different here, Dad. Not like in my drawings of before. And Mum, you pretend you're okay, but you cry when you think I'm sleeping. And Sophie turned to the woman who'd unknowingly hosted her for 2 weeks. Your house is beautiful, but it's like those fake rooms in furniture stores. No one really lives here. No one laughs or makes messes or loves here. Not really. Elena moved to stop her daughter, but Sophie pulled out one final drawing. It showed all 4 of them, standing together, with words carefully printed across the top. Sometimes love means fixing what's broken, not throwing it away. I heard you tell Aunt Jenny that Dad threw away our family for someone new, Sophie said to her mother. But that's not how love works, is it? When my bike broke, we didn't throw it away. Dad fixed it. When Mum's favorite mug cracked, we glued it back together. So why can't we try to fix our family? Tears streamed down Elena's face as she knelt beside her daughter. David stepped forward, his architect's hands shaking as he picked up one of the drawings, the one of their last Christmas together. I remember this, he said softly. You were so excited about that art set we got you. You drew pictures all day. And you and Mum made hot chocolate and said it was the best Christmas ever, Sophie added. Was that a lie? Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. I should give you some privacy. No, Sophie said firmly. You need to be here too, because Dad cares about you, and that makes you part of this. But caring about someone new doesn't mean you have to stop caring about the people you loved first. That's what I learned by coming here. The adults stared at this small prophet in their midst, this wise soul in a child's body who had orchestrated this confrontation with nothing but a sketchbook and hope. I know you all think I'm just a kid, Sophie continued, her voice wavering but determined. But sometimes kids see things better because we haven't learned to make things complicated yet. Love shouldn't be complicated. It should be like my drawing, simple and true. Elena reached for her daughter, pulling her close. Oh, baby. When did you get so wise? David knelt beside them, his eyes wet. Sophie, I'm so sorry. I never meant to, I didn't realize. Sarah watched the family from her window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She saw herself as Sophie must have seen her, a beautiful but hollow addition to a story that had been written long before she entered it. The perfect rooms of her townhouse suddenly felt cold, sterile, lacking the warmth that radiated from the 3 people huddled together over a child's drawings. She's right, Sarah said quietly, turning to face them. About all of it. This isn't, none of this is how it should be. She met Elena's eyes for the first time. I'm sorry. I am. In the days following the confrontation at Sarah's townhouse, the world seemed to shift on its axis. David moved back to his apartment, but this time with a different purpose. The sleek furniture and minimalist decor that had once represented his new life now felt like props in a play he'd been performing, a play about a man he thought he wanted to be. He sat in his office, Sophie's drawings spread across his drafting table. Each crayon stroke told a story he'd been too blind to see: the gradual distance in Elena's smile, the growing emptiness in their home, the way Sophie had started drawing their family with dotted lines instead of solid ones. As an architect, he'd always prided himself on seeing the subtle details, yet he'd missed the most important blueprint of all: his daughter's heart. I'd like to recommend someone, Sarah had said during their final conversation at the office. She'd handed him a business card for a family counselor. I've been seeing her myself, trying to understand everything. Her voice had caught slightly. She's helped me realize some things about myself, about why I was so drawn to someone else's story instead of writing my own. Elena was hesitant when David first suggested counseling, but Sophie's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes love means fixing what's broken. During their first session, Dr. Martinez had them sit with Sophie's drawings between them like a bridge. Tell me about these moments, the counselor suggested, pointing to the happy scenes Sophie had captured. What changed? We stopped dancing, Elena said suddenly, surprising herself. Remember, David? We used to dance in the kitchen every Sunday morning. While the pancakes burned, David added softly, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. Sophie would always complain about the smell, but she never missed watching us. The sessions weren't easy. Years of unspoken resentments, of dreams deferred, of communication broken down into terse texts about schedules and responsibilities. It all had to be excavated, examined, understood. Sometimes they left Dr. Martinez's office feeling raw, other times hopeful. But they kept going, week after week, because their daughter had shown them something precious, the possibility of redemption. Sarah, too, began her own journey of transformation. She took a design project in Chicago, a chance to step away and find herself beyond the reflection in David's eyes. "Your daughter saw right through my perfect room," she wrote in her farewell email to David. "She helped me see them too beautiful but empty. I need to fill my own spaces before I try to share them with someone else." At home, small changes began to bloom like spring flowers after a long winter. Elena found herself humming again while she gardened. David started coming over for dinner once a week, not to rekindle romance, but to rebuild trust, to learn how to be parents together, even if they couldn't be partners right away. One evening, as Sophie worked on her homework at the kitchen table, she looked up to see her parents washing dishes together, not touching, not dancing, but existing in the same space with a familiar comfort that had been missing for so long. "Dad," she asked, twirling her pencil between her fingers. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we fixed yet?" Elena and David exchanged a look over the sudsy dishes, a look that held pain and hope in equal measure. "We're learning how to fix things," Elena answered carefully, "just like you said, piece by piece, day by day." David dried his hands and came to sit beside his daughter. Some things can't go back to exactly how they were before, he explained. But sometimes, if we're brave enough to try, we can build something new that's just as strong. Like when we redesigned your treehouse after the storm knocked it down, remember? Sophie nodded, reaching for her ever-present sketchbook. She opened to a fresh page and began to draw her family again, this time with solid lines connecting them all, but in a new configuration. Not broken, not perfect, but real and healing. 6 months later, the Warren family kitchen buzzed with the comfortable chaos of Sunday dinner. The smell of slightly burnt pancakes wafted through the air, a tradition revived, though now served for dinner rather than breakfast. Sophie sat at her usual spot, adding the finishing touches to her latest masterpiece, while Elena and David moved around each other with practiced ease, setting the table. "Done," Sophie announced, holding up her drawing. This one was different from her earlier works, more sophisticated somehow, just as she had grown. The picture showed her family as they were now, her mother and father sitting at opposite ends of the dinner table, but connected by warm smiles and the shared love for their daughter between them. In the background, through a window, a figure that looked like Sarah could be seen walking her own path, carrying what appeared to be a portfolio of design plans. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Elena said, studying the drawing. "This one's going on the fridge." "Next to your acceptance letter to the art program," David added proudly, referring to the special weekend classes Sophie had started attending. She'd discovered her true passion through all of this, using art to help people understand each other better. As they settled in for their weekly family dinner, Sophie looked at her parents. They weren't back together in the way she'd originally hoped, but there was something else, something real. Her father still lived in his apartment, though it now had a wall dedicated to her artwork and photos of their family. Her mother had started dating again, tentatively, and somehow that was okay too. They had all learned that love could take many forms, all of them valid. "You know," David said, passing the syrup, "I got a letter from Sarah last week. She's opening her own design firm in Chicago, specializing in family-friendly spaces." Elena smiled genuinely. "Good for her. Sometimes the hardest adventures are the ones we take alone." Sophie added this moment to her mental collection, not of what was lost, but of what they had found: strength, truth, and the wisdom to see love in all its complex, beautiful forms. After all, as her father often said now, quoting his favorite 9-year-old philosopher, sometimes the biggest truths come in the smallest packages. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful family stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Have you ever experienced a moment where wisdom came from an unexpected source? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most profound insights come from the most surprising places. Coming up next week, the birthday letter that changed 3 generations, another touching story about family, forgiveness, and the bonds that connect us all. Click the bell icon so you don't miss it.